All right, so you guys wanted to hear more about the case of Jerome Dennis in New Jersey.
Yeah, a really, really fascinating case too, from a criminology standpoint.
For sure. And I think it really, makes you think about how the justice system works,
Yeah.
especially like how do you deal with violent offenders, right? Like what's the best way to handle that?
Mhm.
And with Dennis, it's even more complicated because, well, for one thing, he started committing crimes so young, like crazy young. He was only 14 when he and his brother were already involved in some serious stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely what we call an early start, and it's a big predictor
Mhm.
often of, someone becoming what we call a life course persistent offender. Basically, their criminal behavior starts early and just keeps going.
And sadly, I mean, it seems like Dennis really fits that pattern. So
Hmm.
let's go all the way back to the beginning of his life, try to understand where it all started. He grew up in Newark, New Jersey, seventh out of nine kids. Wow, big family.
Yeah, that's a lot of siblings.
And it sounds like he was raised mostly by his mom in a pretty tough neighborhood.
It was definitely not the most supportive environment, let's just say.
Right, and the sources we looked at even mentioned that the police already knew about him when he was just 11. Like he was already on their radar.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but he was never actually charged with anything because he was so young.
And that makes you wonder maybe if there had been some intervention then, maybe things could have turned out differently. Who knows? It's hard to say.
Yeah, for sure. It's always tough to speculate. But it does seem like even at that young age, there were signs that something wasn't right.
Absolutely. And what's especially striking is that, his crimes weren't just like petty theft. I mean, by 14, he had already participated in a really horrific act with his brother, William.
Yeah, I mean that rape case is just
It's disturbing on so many levels, and what makes it even more bizarre is that they called the police on themselves afterward.
wait, seriously.
Yeah, it's like, what were they thinking? It's almost like they wanted to get caught.
That's so strange. I've never heard of anything like that before.
It definitely suggests some kind of, psychological complexity there.
For sure. And then on top of that, you have the father testifying against his own sons. I mean, that's almost unheard of.
That is really unusual. Yeah, you don't see that very often.
It makes you wonder what was going on in that family? What
Mhm.
could have driven him to do that?
I mean, it speaks volumes about the family dynamics. Whatever was happening in that household, it must have been incredibly dysfunctional.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, to have your own father testify against you, that's got to be tough.
Definitely. And as a result of all of that, Jerome ended up being sentenced to 30 years in prison.
30 years. And he was only 14 at the time.
Yeah, just 14 years old for rape, false imprisonment, and armed robbery.
That's a huge sentence for a teenager. I mean,
It really is. And it raises all these questions about juvenile justice, right? Like, how do you balance punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation, especially when you're dealing with someone so young who's already capable of such extreme violence?
that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like how do you even begin to rehabilitate someone like that? I mean, is it even possible?
That's what's so fascinating about this case, right? It really makes you question whether the system helped Dennis or actually made him worse in some way.
That's a scary thought, but it's definitely something to consider. And to make things even more complicated, fast forward to 1991, after serving 10 years of that sentence.
He was granted parole.
Get this, within 2 months, he starts his terrifying spree, attacking 7 women in Essex County, New Jersey.
It's just mind-boggling how someone with his history could be deemed safe to return to society.
Right. It really makes you question the whole parole system, doesn't it?
Big time. I mean, was he truly rehabilitated? Did they even assess the risk factors properly?
It's like, did they just completely drop the ball?
It's hard to say for sure, but his case definitely highlights the potential flaws in the system.
And I think it also forces us to confront this really tough question. Like, how effective is our justice system when it comes to actually rehabilitating violent offenders?
That's the core issue, isn't it? Like, what's the goal of incarceration? Is it just punishment, or is it also about trying to help these individuals change their behavior?
And if it is about rehabilitation, then are we doing it right? I mean, clearly in this case, something went wrong.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's important to remember that, behind all the legal jargon and the statistics, these were real people whose lives were tragically cut short or forever altered by Dennis's actions.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget about the victims.
And it's crucial to really acknowledge the pain and suffering that they went through.
I mean, it's heartbreaking to think about what they and their families had to endure.
Yeah, no words can really express that kind of loss.
And it's important for us to to say their names,
To honor their memory.
to remember that these were real people, not just statistics in some case file.
Absolutely. Their lives mattered, and they deserve to be remembered.
So we have Zelda Bailey,
Robin Carter,
Elizabeth Klenner,
Stephanie Alston,
Khadijah Harris,
Jamila Jones.
and Shakia Hedgepeth.
And it's worth noting that, thankfully, Zelda Bailey and Khadijah Harris actually survived their attacks.
That's a small glimmer of hope in this otherwise really dark story.
Uh,
But what's also really chilling is how the violence in his attacks seemed to escalate. Like it started with rape, but then it progressed to bludgeoning and even stabbing.
that is a very disturbing pattern.
It makes you wonder, was that a sign of desperation? Or was there like a psychological shift happening within him?
It's possible, sometimes as a killer continues their spree, they can become more and more desensitized to the violence.
Like, it's almost like they're losing touch with their own humanity.
Exactly. And it's not hard to imagine the fear that must have gripped those communities. I mean, Newark and East Orange, as the bodies started to be discovered,
Oh, yeah. It must have been terrifying for people.
especially back then, in the early 90s. Information didn't spread the same way it does now.
Right. Like, no social media, no instant updates.
Exactly. People were relying on word of mouth, news reports that might be delayed.
And you know how it is, like, rumors start to spread, things get exaggerated.
The information vacuum can be a breeding ground for fear and speculation.
No doubt. And on top of that, there were even some misreported body counts early on. So people were even more scared than they needed to be.
It's crazy to think about how differently that might have played out if it happened today. With the 24/7 news cycle and everyone constantly on social media.
It would have been a completely different media landscape.
Oh, for sure. I mean, can you imagine the pressure on law enforcement with all that scrutiny?
Yeah, they would have been under a microscope.
Absolutely. And even without all of that, I mean, the pressure on them back then was still immense.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely feeling the heat. I mean, they ended up forming a whole task force with the FBI just to try to catch this guy.
Wow, that shows you how seriously they were taking it.
Yeah, I mean, they were pulling out all the stops. And, it wasn't just the police who were affected. Like, the whole community was on edge. There were community meetings. People were giving out self-defense advice.
It really shows you how much of an impact Dennis's crimes had on everyday life.
People were scared to leave their houses.
It's like their sense of safety was completely shattered.
And for a while, it seemed like he might actually get away with it all.
It's like he was a ghost just disappearing into the night.
But then there was a break in the case. A pretty big one, actually.
What happened?
Well, the investigators finally learned about his prior rape conviction, the one from when he was 14 with his brother.
Oh, right.
And they were like, wait a minute, this guy's got a history of violence. We need to look into this further.
And that's when things started to unravel for him.
Yeah, I mean, once they had that piece of the puzzle, it all started to come together. And then the surviving victims were able to identify him from a photo lineup.
That must have been a huge relief for the investigators.
Oh, yeah, it's a major breakthrough in the case. So in April of 1992, they finally arrested him.
Wow, so a little over a year after his parole.
Yeah, and the evidence against him was pretty overwhelming at that point.
I mean, we're talking 35 felonies, including 5 counts of murder.
Yeah, it was a pretty airtight case.
But even then, there were still some people who were skeptical. They thought maybe the police were just trying to appease the public, like they needed to arrest someone, anyone, just to calm everyone down.
I can see how people might think that, especially given the amount of fear and pressure that was out there.
Yeah, it was a very emotionally charged situation.
And then, on top of all of that, Dennis does something completely unexpected.
What's that?
After initially pleading innocent, he confesses to all the murders.
Wow, that's a big twist.
Yeah, it came out of nowhere.
It makes you wonder, why would he do that? I mean, what was his motivation?
Right. Was it remorse? Did he just want to get it off his chest? Or was he, trying to manipulate the system in some way?
Maybe he was hoping for a lighter sentence.
Or maybe he wanted the notoriety, Some serial killers crave that attention.
It's definitely a question that lingers.
And to add another layer of complexity, his lawyer claimed that Dennis had schizophrenia.
Oh, wow. So mental illness could have been a factor as well?
Yeah, and they requested a psychiatric evaluation.
So now you've got this whole other element to consider. I mean, if he was truly suffering from schizophrenia, how much control did he really have over his actions?
That's a tough one, right? Like, where do you draw the line between personal responsibility and mental illness?
It's a question that the courts grapple with all the time.
And it's one that we, as a society, need to keep asking ourselves as well.
Definitely, because the answers are never easy, and they have huge implications for how we approach justice and punishment.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that needs to keep happening. It's crazy to think he confessed to all those murders, and still, he didn't get the death penalty.
Yeah, you're right. It was a pretty big deal when that happened back in '93.
So he basically took this plea deal instead, right?
Yep. Ended up with multiple life sentences, but no death penalty.
But he can't get out on parole until, like, 2052.
Yeah, he'd be 85 by then.
Still, I imagine for the families of the victims, a plea deal just doesn't feel like enough.
No, absolutely, especially in such a horrific case like this.
Like, how could anything ever really be enough to make up for that kind of loss?
It's that whole idea of retribution, right?
Yeah, like, they need to see him punished severely for what he did.
It's completely understandable, I think, a very human response.
Like, you want justice. You want to feel like the punishment actually fits the crime.
Exactly. It's that need to see some kind of balance restored after something so terrible.
But then you have the other side of the argument, right? The folks who are against the death penalty altogether.
Right, they'd say that it doesn't really deter crime anyway.
And that's just, well, it's morally wrong for the state to take a life, no matter what.
Definitely a complex issue. Lots of strong opinions on both sides.
It's one of those big moral debates,
Mm-hmm.
that really gets to the core of what we believe as a society.
No easy answers there.
And you can't ignore the practical side of things either, right? Like death penalty cases, they drag on forever.
Oh yeah, years and years of appeals. It can be a real logistical nightmare.
And they're super expensive too.
So I guess in a way, a plea deal can seem like the more practical solution.
At least it guarantees he's off the streets, right?
And it saves the state a ton of money and resources in the long run.
But still, you're left with these really big questions,
Like, what is the value of a human life, even the life of someone who has done such awful things?
Yeah, it's a tough one, for sure. It really makes you think.
And I think it's also interesting to think about the cultural climate back then,
When Dennis's crimes were happening, the early 90s,
Exactly, because public fear of serial killers was really, I think, at a peak.
it was like they were the ultimate boogeyman.
Totally. They embodied all our worst fears.
They were almost like mythical figures in a way.
Yeah, and think about all the high-profile cases that were happening around that time.
Oh, you mean like Ted Bundy?
Yeah, Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy.
Those were huge.
They were all over the news, and it created this kind of like cultural obsession with serial killers.
Like everyone was fascinated and terrified at the same time.
And that context, I think, is really important to keep in mind because it probably influenced everything from the media coverage to the way the case was handled by law enforcement.
Yeah, like there was so much pressure on them to catch him.
And it makes you wonder, how would things have played out differently if it happened today?
Yeah, with social media and the 24/7 news cycle, it would have been a whole other
Oh,
animal.
for sure. I mean, imagine all the instant speculation and analysis happening online.
And the pressure on the police would have been insane.
It wouldn't just be the local news, it would be national, international even.
It's crazy to think about.
But even without all of that, I think Dennis's case still reveals a lot about our justice system.
And maybe even some of its shortcomings.
It's almost like a case study in what can go wrong, in both individual and systemic failure.
Yeah, like you have his troubled upbringing, the early criminal activity,
All those red flags that weren't really addressed properly.
and then the parole system obviously failed in a big way.
Did they really believe he was rehabilitated? Or were they just, I don't know, hoping for the best?
It's almost like they just set him up to fail.
That's a really disturbing thought.
And then, of course, there's the question of whether prison itself might have made him worse.
Did it harden him? Did it make him more violent?
I mean, it's impossible to know for sure, but it's definitely something to consider.
Especially when you think about the conditions in some prisons, it's not exactly a nurturing environment.
That's like, are we really trying to rehabilitate people, or are we just warehousing them?
Yeah, and if we are trying to rehabilitate them, are we doing it in a way that actually works?
Because in Dennis's case, clearly, something went very wrong.
And I think it also comes back to the idea of addressing the root causes of crime,
Like poverty, lack of education, all those factors that can contribute to someone ending up in the system in the first place.
Yeah, if we want to prevent future tragedies, we need to invest in communities, in education, in opportunity.
It's about giving people the tools they need to build a better life for themselves, to make different choices.
Exactly, because punishment alone isn't enough.
It's got to be about more than just locking people up.
We need to focus on prevention, on rehabilitation, on really trying to understand what leads someone down that path.
And I think it's also about accountability, you know,
Accountability for who?
not just for the person who committed the crime, but for the systems that are supposed to be there to help, to protect.
You're right. We need to hold those systems responsible for their failures as well.
Like, how did this happen? How do we let this guy slip through the cracks?
And what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Because at the end of the day, those are the questions that really matter, right?
Yeah.
If we want to learn from this case,
We have to be willing to ask those tough questions, to confront the uncomfortable truths about our systems and ourselves.
and to remember that the victims are more than just statistics, you know,
Their lives had meaning, they had value.
and their families are still dealing with the consequences of what happened.
It's a ripple effect that goes on and on.
It's a lot to process, this whole case. It's really heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's not easy to wrap your head around.
But I think it's important that we try, you know,
Absolutely. We have to face these difficult issues, even when it's uncomfortable.
because if we ignore them, nothing will ever change.
And the victims deserve better than that.
They deserve justice. They deserve to be remembered.
And they deserve for us to learn from what happened.
to make sure something like this never happens again. So we've spent a lot of time talking about this case. Jerome Dennis, his crimes, the trial, the aftermath. It's hard not to wonder, you know, was this guy just born evil?
That's the age-old question, right? Nature versus nurture.
Yeah, like, was he destined to become a killer no matter what?
Or did the circumstances of his life, his environment, kind of push him in that direction?
Because we know he had a really rough childhood.
Oh, absolutely. Tons of red flags there.
Poverty, neglect, I mean, you name it.
And all that stuff can have a huge impact on a kid's development, you know?
Especially when it starts so early.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he was already committing crimes at 11.
That's not normal. That's a sign that something is seriously wrong.
It's like a cry for help that no one heard.
And sadly, instead of getting help, he ends up in prison.
Which, you know, you have to wonder if that made things worse.
It's possible, right? Like, did prison actually harden him, make him more violent?
Did it turn him into the monster he ultimately became?
It's a chilling thought, but it's a question we have to ask.
Because it seems like the system failed him on so many levels.
First, by not intervening early enough, then by not providing any real rehabilitation while he was locked up.
It's like, what was the point of those 10 years he served?
If it wasn't to help him change, to address the underlying issues, then what was it for?
And this brings us back to this bigger point, right?
About rehabilitation versus punishment.
Like, what's the goal of our justice system?
Is it just to punish people for their crimes?
Or is it also to try to help them become better, to break the cycle of violence?
Because if it's the latter, then we need to rethink how we approach things.
We need to invest in programs that actually work.
We need to address the root causes of crime, like poverty, lack of education, all that stuff.
Because those things matter, they shape people's lives, they influence their choices.
And we can't just ignore them and expect people to magically change once they're behind bars.
It's like we have to give them the tools to build a better life for themselves.
To make different choices, to break free from that cycle of violence.
But it also requires us to acknowledge that the system itself has flaws.
Like the parole board, in Dennis's case, they completely dropped the ball.
Did they not see the warning signs?
Did they not understand the risk he posed to the community?
Or were they just, I don't know, overwhelmed, understaffed, whatever?
Whatever the reason, the outcome was tragic.
And it highlights the need for accountability, not just for individuals, but for the system as a whole.
We can't just blame Dennis for everything. We have to look at the bigger picture.
We have to ask ourselves, how did this happen?
And what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Because if we don't learn from these mistakes, then what's the point?
The victims deserve better than that.
Their families deserve better. The community deserves better.
And I think it's also important to, to remember that this isn't just about statistics or legal arguments.
It's about real people whose lives were shattered.
People who lost loved ones, who suffered trauma, who will never be the same.
We can't let their pain be forgotten amidst all the talk about the killer, the trial, the system.
We have to humanize the victims. We have to honor their memory.
And we have to fight for a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to happen.
A world where people get the help they need before it's too late.
A world where communities are safe, where justice is served, and where healing is possible.
That's the goal, right? That's what we should all be striving for.
It might seem like a distant dream, especially after diving deep into a case like this.
But I think it's important to hold on to that hope, that belief that things can get better.
Because if we lose that hope, then we've already lost the battle.
So keep asking questions, keep learning, keep pushing for change.
And never forget the victims.
Because their stories matter, their lives mattered.
And we owe it to them to make the world a better place. That's all the time we have for today. But if this case has you wanting to learn more, there are a ton of resources out there. Mindhunter by John Douglas is a great one. He's a former FBI profiler. Really gets into the minds of serial killers.
Yeah, that's a classic. And The Anatomy of Motive by Douglas and Olshaker is another good one. It's more about the psychology of crime, the why behind it all.
So yeah, check those out if you're interested. And remember, this deep dive was inspired by you, our listeners. You asked us to take a closer look at the Jerome Dennis case, and we hope you found it insightful, even though it was pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, it was a tough one, but these conversations are important.
So keep sending us your suggestions. We're always looking for new topics to explore.
We love diving deep into these complex issues with you.
So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those suggestions coming.
Stay curious, everyone.